All right, welcome everybody. This is Keith from Last Call Bar Academy, and we've got a group of students, most of whom got their scores today, or are going to be taking the LSAT again, possibly in August or October. And so they've given me their personal stories, and we're going to start talking about how to go about prepping for a repeat, particularly when you're a high scorer, because I find that the materials are not well suited to high scorers. All right, here's the presentation that I created for today's lesson. My YouTube channel is called LSAT Life, and if you guys can't attend my weekly sessions live, please feel free to subscribe to that. I've been uploading them on there, and so they're kind of long, boring videos. But Carmen might be helping me to call through that, and trying to convince her to do it. Help me call through that and create something a little more engaging than an hour-long video. But you can follow me there. We also have a podcast called LSAT Life that I do with Jacob Feldman and John Richardson, who's the host of the Facebook LSAT study group. And so if you'd like to follow our podcast, you can find us on Spotify. Today, we're going to talk about repeaters and high scores. And so we all know it's score release day, and this is high stakes. We've got a lot of people who are really happy and a lot of people who are disappointed. The thing that I want you guys to know is there's far more people who are disappointed. Like, no matter where you've scored, most people set their goals really high and wanted a higher score than they received. And part of that's confirmation bias. When you're doing practice tests, your highest score, you tend to view it as your actual potential. And then you view your lowest score as an anomaly because you were distracted or whatever. But in reality, your actual potential is somewhere in between your highest and lowest, practice test scores. That's where we would zero in if you took a large number of tests. So what I find is that when people tell me, well, I was doing consistently better before the official test, which is what some of you have told me, that may have been the pattern on 2 or 3 exams. But if we take a trailing average going back 5 or 10 exams, usually the result is pretty much in line with that. Now, that's not to say that some people don't underperform. Some people do for various reasons. And so then you have to go back and figure out how to change your study habits to avoid underperforming in the same way again. And that's one of the messages that I want to give you guys is whatever you've been doing, stop doing that. Try something new, or at least identify what it is that's working about your study regimen and what's not working about it. And I want to give you all some tips today about how to organize an effective study regimen for the LSAT. And then you can think about what's missing in your own study regimen. But you shouldn't feel like you have failed. I mean, understand that maximizing your LSAT score almost always entails multiple attempts. It's not it's inherent to the way that the admissions process is run. If they're going to look at your highest score and they're going to allow you to take multiple attempts, nobody can maximize his or her potential without multiple attempts. It's like saying, okay, I want you to hit a hole in one. Do you want one shot or do you want 10 tries? Like, anytime you're dealing with the performance of a skill that might fail, you want as many tries as possible. So taking the LSAT several times is part of the process. You shouldn't feel like you failed, even if you are far into the process. It took me about 2 years to get the final score that I needed. And even then, it was 6 points below my goal score. So set your goals high and then be realistic in your expectations and negotiate well in your admissions. Make sure that you're thinking about this as a holistic process, not just a singular number. The other thing that I want to make sure you guys are doing is leave enough time between your retakes. What's the right amount of time? That's such a tricky question. I think many people underperform and then register again immediately. Big mistake, I think. Unless you were hitting your goal score prior to the test. I mean, I think one of the problems is that people register and take the exam and they haven't demonstrated on timed practice tests that they can consistently hit their goal score. I mean, that's one of the biggest reasons for underperforming on the LSAT. You just weren't prepared to take the exam. Unfortunately, that's the low hanging fruit. If you never hit your goal score and then you took the exam, I can tell you right now, the problem is you didn't study enough. Study until you're hitting your goal score and then register for the exam, and don't try to dictate the timeline. But some of you were hitting your goal score consistently and then underperformed on the LSAT. And so that leaves you in kind of a quandary. When should you retake? I'm sort of the mind that you don't want to lose the momentum, and that probably August is the right date. But the huge caveat to that is that assumes that you were hitting your goal score consistently before June. If that's not true, I would definitely not register for August. I wouldn't even register for October. I would go to the sub bullet point there. I would start studying using a rigorous study program until you're hitting your goal score consistently, several prep tests in a row, timed. The other thing that I'll mention here is that I have developed a study method called triple review. It's based on 40 years of teaching experience, if you count my partner's contribution to that, Jacob Feldman. And Jake and I both geek out on psychology of learning. We're not just teachers, we're students of the craft. And so both of us read a lot about growth mindset, about the psychologies that foster deep learning environments. And so triple review, it's based on learning science. It's based on what we know about what are the best methods for most people to learn. So I want to talk about triple review a little bit. And even if you don't buy into triple review in our form, I want you to think about what it offers and what you can borrow from it to supplement your study schedule. What do you need to have an effective study schedule or effective study method? Let's start really high level. Here are the things that frustrate me the most when I'm working with a student. Number one, if they don't have a consistent study schedule. If they're studying haphazardly in their leftover spare time, they rarely make progress that way. I heard someone say something really poignant one time. They said, "Show me your calendar and I'll show you what's important to you." Do you have LSAT prep scheduled on your calendar so that your friends and family know when you're unavailable, and so that you can get into the mindset that that time is reserved for an important activity? Or are you waiting until you feel like studying for the LSAT? Because when I wait until I feel like working, I end up just surfing Facebook for a couple hours. When I get up in the morning and I make a schedule and say at 8 o'clock, I'm going to make an ad. At 9 o'clock, I'm going to study prep test 73. At 10 o'clock, I'll do this. I get so much more done. So consistent scheduling is part of the process, organizing your time. I never met a single good lawyer who was disorganized, particularly with time management. All right, bullet point number two. The second thing that frustrates me the most about not you guys, but working with LSAT students in general, is that they tend to focus on strategy guides rather than official materials. You're not going to get tested on how well you understand the PowerScore Bibles. They will never ask you, which chapter will you turn to answer a strengthened question in the 2021 version of the Logic Reasoning Bible. The Bibles are a supplement, and they've become a very bloated supplement. And so while I think that there is a place for the PowerScore Bibles, I think if you're spending more time studying those than you are studying the exam itself, then your scheduling is misguided. Like that's a flip-flopped order of priority. You should be spending the most time looking at the exam and the official material, and then the supplement should be something you turn to when you reach your conceptual limit, when you can't figure something out on your own. All right, next. Your study method should feature spaced repetition. That's hard to accomplish on the LSAT, where every question is verbalized differently and the patterns are disguised. It's probably most obvious that repetition is important on logic games. Seven Sage embraces this foolproofing method where you do every game 10 times, or until you can do it under a certain time. I don't know what they do, but it's about repeating the game multiple times. When I first started teaching the LSAT, that was one of the unforeseen things that I learned. I believed that once I had studied everything, I would sort of reach my peak. it didn't occur to me that restudying the same material would be the real source of most of my learning. In fact, some of the arguments, some of the games are so complicated that I think you almost can't learn from them the first time you see them. You're just trying not to drown. All of your mental energy is spent interpreting and solving the game. There's no bandwidth left over to learn and analogize and figure out what to do the next time. It's not until you do the game a second time or a third time using my triple review study strategy, that's when you really start to grapple with some of the deeper, finer points of the game. That's when you can finally ask, how should I have done it the first time? But one time through, you learn very little. The other thing is you need to have targeted strategy planning. The flaw of the Bibles, I think, for many students, I mean, they're great books, but they try to do too much. You're trying to adopt someone else's strategy top down. And that person's strategy is Robin Singh and all of the master test takers who he's hired over the past 2 decades. You're talking about the most complex strategy there is for the LSAT, the most complex strategy guide that there is from some of the top LSAT takers. You're going to take that and implement it. That would be like me saying, I'm going to learn how the best coders in the world do it. And having very little experience, I'll do it that way. That's not how to learn coding. You have to get in at the entry point that meets your level of understanding, which may not be the tutor level top 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 strategy guides. All right, finally, I think another thing that's extremely important and is almost entirely missing from every strategy book, and really you only get this through private tutoring, is the metacognition, thinking about thinking, where someone is not just thinking about the question, but thinking about how you think about the question. And you can accomplish that without a tutor. I realize that private instruction is extremely expensive. I mean, you're basically paying someone to sit there and study you the way that you're studying the test. That's why it's so expensive. It requires a very high degree of skill and effort for someone to take an hour, watch you study, and figure out how your brain works and how to fix it. And if you want to save that money, then you have to do the process of documenting what you've done, how you've thought about the questions, and then going back and rethinking that, thinking about the way you thought about it, and engineering better ways to solve the problems. That's the only way to move forward once you've hit that plateau. You honestly have to have better models. The test tricks aren't going to work for you at that point. And some of you are at that point. 165, 170 is where I think the test gimmicks start to give out. And at that point, the remaining questions that you're missing are not necessarily amenable to test gimmicks. You're going to have to learn fundamentals better, or you'll have to become so proficient at those gimmicks that you can race through the predictable material and then have a long time to dwell on the more complicated questions. And so I embrace kind of a combination of both. I want you to know all the test tricks. Who wouldn't? But I don't want you to stop there. I also want you to have processes for doing the deeper thinking when you get to the harder questions. So it's a two-pronged approach. You need to have enough time when you get to them to sort them out. And then you need a deeper framework that allows you to unpack the details of those and, make a more disciplined answer. All right, here's what triple review is all about. I mentioned that it was 3 rounds, 3 repetitions of each section that you do or each practice test that you do. The first one's timed. My take is that if you start studying the section, you've ruined it as an opportunity to test your skill. So if you're going to use a section as a measurement tool, you have to do the time review first. And I think this time step is so important. Tajay mentioned in her prep that she's done a lot of studying from the strategy guides, but she feels like timing is really the biggest problem. I make that problem front and center by having my students do the time section first before they look at the strategy guide. Everything that we do in that strategy guide should be geared toward how do I go back and take that to the time test and use it? And our conclusion for certain things is going to be you can't. That process is too laborious. It would never work on a time test. It doesn't mean it's useless. It might be fine for skill building on step 2 or step 3, but we need to understand which strategies are for time tests and which ones aren't. Which ones are for skill building. It's like you use a different form if you're trying to lift your max bench press than you do if you're trying to do your daily workout. You can cheat your form a little bit and get a heavier weight up, but if you're building your daily workout, why in the world would you cheat the form? You pay special attention to the form. That's what blind review is about. It's the form. After you've taken the time test, if you can resist the temptation to look up the answers, that's the key. You should not look up what the correct answers are. You shouldn't even look up which questions you've gotten wrong, because as soon as you have hints, it changes the way that you think about the question. Once you know you're wrong, you'll never consider the answer you picked again. You've robbed yourself of the opportunity to actually figure out what's wrong with it. Because now when you look at it, you know it's wrong and you're explicitly looking for the point of failure instead of analyzing it from that point of neutrality, which is how you'll be taking the test. So I think that you want blind review to be a very creative process. I enjoy blind review. I love looking at tests on blind review because I can explore nuances that I didn't have time to explore on the time section. I can go to the dictionary and figure out what things mean. I can symbolize relationships that I had no time to symbolize on the time test. I can look at some of the syllogistic forms that I'm familiar with and try to match it up and see how the argument works. What's the intended logic? I can create more robust articulations of the flaw or the assumption of the argument, even if they're not asking me about that. Think about that. The questions where they aren't asking you about the assumption, that doesn't mean that you can't use those questions to practice finding assumptions. Of course, you have no time to do that on a time test. That would be absurd. And that's why I think it's so important to tease out what are the skills that you need on a time test versus what are the activities or exercises that are going to help you develop those skills. Very, very deep analytical review of the arguments, I think, is an important technique in blind review that builds intuition and builds a foundation for time testing. All right, finally, after your blind review, you should go ahead and look up the answers, because in the early development, in the early stages of your development, even an unlimited amount of time won't be enough for you to get every question correct. Those questions are the perfect ones to really go back and review a third time. That's the mind review, and start analyzing what is wrong with my mental model that prevents me from getting this question correct, or prevented me from getting it correct, prevented me from seeing the right answer, or from understanding the right logic. Here's some of the most difficult work that you can do. The mind review is finally where I think that the strategy guides are useful. Once you've reached step 3, you know exactly what you don't know. You know where the point of failure is. You know which chapter of the Power Score Bible is going to be targeted to your problem. Is it strengthened questions you're having trouble with, flaw questions? Is it conditional logic? Is it answer choices that have strong language? You'll be able to kind of pinpoint more precisely where the point of failure is. If you want more information on triple review, take a look at my Facebook page, Last Call Bar Academy. I have some infographics that can help you kind of walk you through the 3 stages of triple review. I honestly think that if you had Law Hub, Merriam-Webster Dictionary, and my 3 triple review flashcards, that would really be all you needed to study for the LSAT. I mean, that wouldn't be ideal, of course. The dictionary is kind of an obscure resource, but you could look up words like necessary, sufficient, justify. You could look up causation and all of the necessary concepts. It's all in there. You would just need to know what to look up, and you would need an organized way of parsing through the exams and studying them. And I think that's what triple review does for you. One of the reasons that I invented this is because it feels horrible to me as I grew in my skill as a tutor. It felt horrible to me to have to charge the rates that I charge. And you say, oh, you don't have to charge it. I don't have to, but I mean, I could work, 80 hours a week instead and have my wife mad at me all the time. So I don't like to do it. I'm trying to have a balance here of taking care of my family, providing a good value to my consumers, etc. But it does bother me that my services are very expensive. And so I started trying to come up with a supplement so that my students could do as much of the work on their own as possible and then engage with me when they had reached their conceptual limit. And I find if they've gone through the triple review process, they tend to come to the tutoring sessions more informed about where they need help. And we get to the basis of their problems more quickly because they've already grabbed the low hanging fruit and solved the easy problems. They don't come to me for that. They come to me for the most challenging questions. That makes me feel better about charging the rate that I do. If I'm one of the few teachers who can explain the absolute most difficult issues on the exam, well, then I do think that there is some value to that. All right, let's get back to more practical matters. How should you start scheduling for the exam? Many of you told me that you're going to take in August. So I looked at the calendar. We have 7 weeks until the August exam. If I were studying for the LSAT, or if I were designing a study schedule for a student, this is what I would do. Number one, I would determine whether this is a full-time studier or a part-time studier. That would be the very first thing I need to know. Full-time studier means no school, no job. Live at home with your parents for the summer, and you can literally take the next 7 weeks to do nothing but LSAT prep. Part-time studier would mean you have a job or you have some commitments that will prevent you from studying 30 or 40 hours a week. For a full-time studier, I think the right pace is 1 prep test a week, which would give you time for 7 prep tests leading up to the August exam. On the next slide, I have a more granular version of my schedule. What would I do on each of the 7 days? Most of you probably are not full-time studiers. I don't even think I was. Even as a test prep teacher, my attention was divided between the MCAT and SAT and LSAT and my obligations to my students versus my own prep. So I would consider myself a part-time studier, and that's partially why it took me 2 years to complete my LSAT prep. So one of the things I would say is that if you're a part-time studier, August is really not, it's an arbitrary deadline. Why shoot for August? You could postpone. Unless you were hitting your goal score prior to June. I'll go back to that caveat. If so, then we need to figure out, exactly what went wrong in June. It's not a matter of building the skills at that point. But if you just don't have the skills yet, I think 7 weeks is a tall order and you ought to consider postponing until October or later. But during the next 7 weeks, I would, as a part-time studier, I would commit to taking 3 or 4 prep tests. Basically, I would take the schedule that I'm suggesting for the full-time studiers and just cut it in half and say, whatever they do in one day, I'm going to spread out over 2 days. If that person studies, 7 hours a day, I'll do 3 a day. And I'll just take the first 3 hours of their study schedule for day one, the second 3 hours of their first day study schedule for day two, and, map it out over a 2-week period instead of a 1-week period for each prep test. And this schedule can be modified in lots of different ways. So let me show you what I mean. If I were prepping for the LSAT, what I would do for the first 4 days of the week is 1 section on each day. Time section first thing in the morning, then start to blind review it without looking at the answers, without looking up which questions I've gotten wrong. I want to keep a document of my answers from the timed attempt because later on I do want to go reflect back on which questions I missed and why. But I don't want to know that just yet. So I'll start the blind review. For me, it takes me 3 or 4 hours to complete a blind review. So it is surprising to me when my students can do an untimed section more quickly than that. I think that they aren't thinking through the questions as deeply as I want them to. And so for blind review, what I want my students to do is document their reasoning for everything. Why did you eliminate every single answer? I mean, I don't need a full thesis, but you better have a few words circled and a quick sketch of why those words were problematic. I want an explanation of every wrong answer that you eliminated and why every, a justification for every answer other than it was the only one left after my process of elimination. Blind review is far more demanding than just finding the right answers. It entails organizing arguments, organizing diagrams, and doing things better than you did on your timed attempt, understanding the game at a deeper level. I think that breaks are really important to learning projects. And so I would schedule lots of breaks in your day. I usually cannot complete a blind review of a section in one sitting. I'll usually need at least one break, sometimes two breaks, because the process becomes so tedious, especially on LR. At least on logic games, there's sort of obvious sections of the section. LR is just one after another. And I find after 5 or 6 or 7, I start to lose my focus and I'm not paying attention. I'm not following the steps as diligently as I want to in blind reviews. So I just step away for a little while, take a break, come back, continue blind reviewing. And on the breaks that don't entail eating breaks, I should have added this. I think physical activity is super important. It's mental health is very much tied up with physical health. And so being active every single day, I make it a point to be active for 1 hour a day, even when I have a full tutoring schedule, because I think that that is important to my intellectual health. It's important to the kind of product I can provide for my students as a tutor. The other thing that I would schedule on a regular basis, starting now over the next 7 weeks, is that you should be doing supplemental reading, not PowerScore Bibles, but content reading. Which topics on the LSAT do you hate? Go read those. If it's economics, try The Economist. I really disliked, I shouldn't say disliked, but I was unfamiliar with art critiques, literary critiques, that kind of passage. So I started reading a magazine called Juxtapose, art appreciation scholarship, basically. If science is your big issue, start reading Scientific American, but not the online version. You have to get a subscription or a print copy to get the full content of the magazine. My reasoning for this is that I think that the LSAT is not just a logic test, but I think there are certain questions where what they consider to be a common sense assumption is part of the body of that discipline. In other words, for example, there's some arguments that rely on some knowledge of genetics or some knowledge of how evolution works. And that's not a purely logical matter. I mean, that's sort of a scientific principle. And so it is not exactly true to say that it's a pure logic test and that it's completely devoid of content. If you can come at the test from two angles, where you have a strong grasp of the logic and you have a strong grasp of the content, then if one or the other fails, you have an alternate strategy to guide you. Sometimes the logic of the argument may not be apparent to me, but I'm just familiar with the scientific scholarship on that topic. Or vice versa, I may be completely unfamiliar with the scholarship, but I have strong enough logic skills to penetrate the question anyway. So I would schedule regular time reading supplemental material that's targeted toward your weaknesses on the LSAT, the types of passages that you find beguiling. For many people, it's philosophy. Moral philosophy I find to be very challenging, and legal philosophy is also quite dense and abstract. So if those are your weak points, find some philosophy journals, Harvard Law Review or something like that. I think it's called Harvard Law Journal. Oh, no, it's Yale Law Journal, Harvard Law Review, right? Days 2, 3, and 4 would basically be a rinse and repeat of day 1. Oh, I forgot to mention the mind reviews, right? It's blind review, mind review is strategy planning, metacognition, all of that. Days 2, 3, and 4 repeat. Section 2, Section 3, Section 4. Every prep test has 4 sections. So there's 4 days of my week. Wait, I skipped one. Where's day 5? What I want also for my students to do is to dedicate 1 or 2 days to consolidating the learnings from the triple review process. Now that you've done all that, you've studied the test 3 times. What weaknesses have you identified and how are you going to fix them? I mean, let's be very pragmatic and practical about it. Can you identify 1 or 2 or 3 things, let's say one thing for each section, that caused you, was the biggest mistake you made on the section, caused you to miss the most number of questions? If you can identify that, next step is, how do I fix that? How do I treat that situation or that kind of logic in a better, more principled way? You might not have the answer to that. The answer to that might be in the Power Score Bible, or it might be, let me go do a drill of flaw questions so I can get that language in my head. Or it might be, I've tried everything. Let me see what a tutor has to say about this. But notice the emphasis, that's at the end. That's after you've done all of the really hard conceptual work of trying to figure out the test yourself, and you're not relying on someone else to just spoon feed you the answers. Then you're primed and ready for someone to spoon feed a little bit to you. So I do think there is a time and a place for strategy guides and tutors, but I think it should be secondary to your study of the real test. You should be spending 4 of the 7 days studying the official test, and maybe 1 or 2 days doing drills and strategy guides to unpack the errors that you've made. I also think that it's extremely important when you are engaged in cognitive tasks to schedule breaks, not just during the day, but long breaks, days where you're not going to think about the LSAT. And one of the things that I haven't mentioned on here is, what about the importance of sleep? This is why scheduling is so important. This is why realistic goals are so important. If you have a very demanding job, if you can only study 1 or 2 hours a day, I still think you can do very well on the LSAT, but it all hinges on consistency and reasonable expectations. If you're limited to 2 hours a day, forget about 3 months. Because what you're going to find is you're not making the progress you want. You start trying to study more hours. You're sacrificing the quality of your study time for quantity of your study time. You're sacrificing breaks, you're sacrificing rest, you're sacrificing physical activity, and none of those things bode well for successful learning projects. So we have to think about this holistically and try to make sure that we are being healthy in all respects. And then your learning goals will just happen automatically if you have the right plan in place. You won't have to think about the score. All right, let me do one more slide and then I'll let you guys jump in with some questions. If you do get a tutor, if you hire me, I'm very expensive. How should you utilize me or another tutor? I think explanations can be a huge crutch. As a young teacher, I found myself just explaining questions one by one. You can learn that way, but it's not the most efficient way to learn. And in fact, at some point, learning that way can actually obscure the fact that you can't find the explanation on your own and that you need the explanation to understand the question. This was made really clear to me one day when I was prepping to become an LSAT teacher. And I was asked to prep a lesson on an LR question for the other trainees, right? It was like a mock classroom where I'm going to teach this question. I couldn't understand the damn question. I couldn't come up with a principled way to explain it. Every other trainee in this group tried to help me with it. We were all supposed to go to 6th Street that night. So they were like, hurry up, let me just show you how to do it and then we'll be done with it. And I was getting really frustrated because despite the fact that they were smart and giving me intelligent explanations, I just couldn't make the right connection in my head. And so I sent them off to 6th Street without me and stayed behind so I could be prepared for the next day of the training. After they left, it took about 5 or 10 more minutes until I made the connection on my own. the learning moment was so palpable that I never forgot it, and I never missed that kind of conditional reasoning question again. It was really hard for me to grasp. But finding the path on my own was a far more powerful learning experience than hearing the explanations of some really smart people who were high level test takers and teachers. Okay, so make sure that you are searching for those paths on your own before you look for the tutor. There are explanations online. That's the other thing. You don't need a tutor to explain individual questions for you. You can just Google search LSAT velocity explanations or the Manhattan Prep forums or the PowerScore forums. You should have already looked at all that when you go talk to your tutor and say, even despite that explanation, here's what I don't get about it. So, on that note, you should have a list of questions for the tutor, either questions that you've formulated, questions about the test, about the questions, about your study methods, or particular questions that you want to review. And even when you're reviewing questions, you should do so with a purpose. It's not just to understand that question, because you'll never see that question again. It's to improve your skill set. And if you look at my triple review infographics, I have some exercises in the strategy planning steps for LR and RC where you convert your wrong answers into right ones. That I think is one of the best logical games that you can play to develop the verbal dexterity to really start to make improvements on the questions that you miss. So that's what I like to do with my students. How do we turn your wrong answers into right ones? If you're still trying to figure out how to understand the question, we're wasting time. We need to be going the next step and thinking about how do we develop that verbal dexterity so that you can spot that really quickly. All right, next, something you can do that will help your tutors tremendously is to document your thinking as much as you can in writing. You can't do so on a timed test. That's another reason why I think blind review is so important. How are you going to know what to tell your tutor if all you did was take a timed test and then identify the questions that you missed? You probably won't even be able to recreate your thought process because our memories are short-term memories really fragile and tainted by emotion. So it's unlikely that you're even going to remember what you were thinking about correctly. You have to go through on blind review, replicate your thinking process without the benefit of the right answer, document your reasoning so that you can take that to your tutor and say, what is wrong with this? Or maybe you'll identify the error on your own, but you see how that kind of tool can be really helpful for the tutor to get into your head so that he or she doesn't have to watch you solve the problem to see the point of failure. You've documented it. If possible, when you're choosing a tutor, I think you should choose someone who's got a really deep perspective on legal education. Of course, I'm biased because as a former professor, that's a distinction that most of the other tutors don't have. But I'll tell you this, that when I prep students for the LSAT, I really do try to incorporate as many of the study skills and as many of the reading skills as I think will be important to law school. I try to make the whole process as relevant and as translatable to 1L exams as possible. And we're in the process of creating 1L materials. They overlap so strongly with what we teach for the LSAT. I do think it's a good exam. The way that they're testing causation is a very complex issue in torts and criminal law. You'll spend months thinking about causation case law. So I think that the LSAT is doing a good job of introducing a complex philosophical topic that you should learn about now. But the tutors who haven't been to law school or don't understand legal education don't know that that's what the test is signaling, that that's what they want you to learn. They try instead to come up with some tricks and gimmicks to just get those questions right and move on. So I think having someone with some perspective on legal education will give you a leg up in the long run. And the other thing that I would say is don't get married to one tutor. Different tutors have different nuggets of wisdom. And a smart student's going to consume as much as possible in an organized fashion. It does frustrate me when my students have too many cooks in the kitchen. They've got 13 strategy guides, and there's no principled way that they're studying. But if they've committed to a particular system and they want different perspectives to supplement that system, I welcome it. I don't shy away from it. In fact, I had a student who took the June test who was really struggling. It was a frustrating experience to me because this student was scoring better timed than she was blind, and I could not figure out why. I asked her to do some sessions with my partner, Jacob Feldman, and before the June test, she did. And her score was 159. She was really thrilled with it. She was PTing in the 150s, and her target score was 160. So it was a successful experience from her. And now she's thinking I can do better instead of fighting for that, respectable score that she needed. It immediately turned a switch for her this morning when she got that score. Within minutes of telling me the score, she was asking me, should I retake? She hit her target, and now she's getting aggressive and thinking, I can get a scholarship out of this. So I think that's the power of getting different perspectives. And that's why I like teaching the classes that I teach with Jacob Feldman, because we just give you two perspectives right up front so that you can understand that there isn't just one way to think about LSAT problems. There's multiple models that work. And frankly, I think you're best served by knowing as many models as possible so that you're not beholden to one particular one in any circumstance. You can apply the one that works best, or if the one that works best doesn't occur to you, you'll have a backup plan. That's the biggest thing that I've gained from working with Jacob. I've always been very, very skilled at the LSAT. Never had a backup plan. If my way didn't work, I mean, I had lots of skills, but my skills were based on predictive inference first approach. Jake bases his approach on brute force post hoc analysis of the answers. Melding those two approaches together has been brilliant because I can continue to make deductions. But when I don't make the deduction, when I don't see the right answer, I have Jake's brute force method to go through and figure it out. And Jake has reported to me the same kind of synergy, that he can continue to use his brute force method, but occasionally he'll see one of the deductive methods that I've taught him, and it saves him some time on enough questions so that he isn't completely exhausted from doing brute force for an entire section. Both of us have become stronger test takers by having this backstop so that when our preferred strategy doesn't work, we've got something in place to pick up the pieces. Okay, I'm talking too much. Let me open it up to questions for 10 minutes or so, and then we'll end for the day. Does anyone want clarity on anything I've said or want me to explore a new topic?
Keith, hey,
Hey, Carlos.
there's something, yeah, I mean, there's something, it has to relate a little bit with schedule, right? And I'm not sure if any other students have felt this, but I started studying for my June one way before I should have. I think it was February. And I ended up getting to June. And by the end, I was feeling some major burnout. And I think, I mean, just kind of in my analysis that I did today, I think it really, it really affected me.
Mm-hmm.
Now, my only thing is I have a bit of a short time scale because I still wanna apply in the fall, but I guess a big question would be how do I adapt the schedule? How do I adapt the schedule like that so I don't burn out? Or what do I do when I start to feel like this isn't, like, my studying is not getting effective, like I'm resenting it more,
Yeah.
and it's not getting results,
Let me ask you this. Are you a full-time studier or part-time?
Part-time, I work.
That I think is really the driver a lot of times of the burnout. You've added an opposing project. This isn't supplemental to your work. It doesn't add to your success at work. Your work doesn't contribute to your LSAT prep. So what you've added to your schedule is deductive. It's not additive to what you're already doing. And The other thing that I would mention, that one of the issues that I face with working adults is the idea of decision fatigue. For me, the LSAT is really fascinating. I rarely suffer from burnout on the LSAT because I have an intrinsic motivation. The material itself I find to be intriguing, and the way that they package it together, I find verbal puns to be really funny. And so the fact that they can give you this really technical nonsense, I think is just brilliant. I love it how they can trick people with something that means nothing. And so for me, it's really fun and engaging to work with the LSAT. But I get that not everyone feels that way. And I think what one of the things that drives that is that when you have work and important decisions in your schedule, it can be really hard to look at an LSAT question and to think that it matters, to care about it. I mean, as a psychological principle, not just as a matter of motivation, like, am I going to will myself to read this and answer it, but as a matter of psychological motivation. How much creativity can you muster to solve the problem after you almost got hit on the freeway and were scared to death at 7 a.m. that morning? After your boss yelled at you and you worried for 30 minutes about whether you'd lose your job? After you had a 2 o'clock deadline for, some work assignment and got it in just on time? After a day like that, I can't fault someone for saying, forget the LSAT. So, what I try to get my students to do is reorganize their study time so that they're studying for the LSAT first and then giving the leftovers to their job. I don't value employers enough to think that they should get the best of your creative efforts. Maybe I'm revealing my political biases a little bit here, but that's how I feel. If they paid me more, maybe I would feel differently, but employers are trying to pay as little as possible and get the most value out of your work as they can. Okay? Then I'm going to organize my life so that I get the most value out of my time as I can. That's the trade-off. If you want to treat me that way as an employee, I will treat you that way as a business. I don't care. I will give my family and my studies my priority, and you will get whatever's left over. And if that's not enough, I guess I'll have to find a new job. So that's how I organize my time. I do the things that matter to me first. I said earlier in this session, show me your schedule and I will tell you what's important to you. I find that to be so profound because when the person said it to me, my study schedule was work, 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 nothing about my family in there. It almost brought me to tears. I thought, I am neglecting my family, and it is evident in my study schedule. I started scheduling time. Last night I scheduled a couple hours to take my wife out to dinner. That's the kind of breaks that I'm talking about. So schedule meaningful things that you can do with your time. And if LSAT prep isn't on your schedule, put it on your schedule. All right, there's a question in the chat here that I'd like to address next. Overwhelmed with the amount of resources. How do I narrow it down? Yes, everybody has a take on the LSAT. This is why I think that your primary study material should be the official tests. It's one of the main reasons. If there was one strategy guide that I thought was head and shoulders above all the others, I would say go get that. But the fact is that each of them offers strengths and weaknesses and a different take on the same thing. And ultimately, you have to be studying the test first. That's my take on it. So if you don't have Law Hub, I would get Law Hub. And then depending on where you are on your prep, I would choose the priority. If you're just starting or if you're far from your goal, I would say I'm going to work on prep tests in the 50 to 60 range so that I don't burn through the new ones. And I'm going to learn my fundamentals with those older tests. If you're closer to the goal, getting close to your goal score, but you still feel like you have some learning to do, I might be using the prep tests in the 70s to study using triple review instead of the prep tests in the 50s or 60s. And then as you get really close to your official exam, you're hitting your goal score and you're finalizing your prep, that's when you want to start exhausting the prep tests from the 80s. See you, Carlos. Thanks for coming. Okay, so let me continue. I did mention that you will need some materials at some point. Which materials are good? Most of you aren't looking for beginning materials. I think the LSAT trainer is very good introduction to the LSAT. If you're getting, 155, 160, you don't need the LSAT trainer. But I also think the PowerScore Bibles are a little bit overkill unless you are committed to consuming them more like an encyclopedia. If you want the best resource out there and you understand that you're not going to read it cover to cover, go ahead and get the PowerScore Bibles. But if you're going to buy them and read them cover to cover, I really probably wouldn't do that unless it was maybe the Logic Games one. And even then, I think that that's not a very efficient way to prep for the LSAT. So then what are the good materials? You know which ones I really like? I think these are really innovative and creative products. These subscription services, the two that I have in mind in particular are 7Sage and LSAT Demon. And I hate to send students to them instead of trying to convert students from my own system. But their price points are just so attractive. Last time I looked, the 7Sage account was $70 a month and up, depending on what level of account you wanted. LSAT Demon was $100 and up a month. Those are significant sums of money, but not unreasonable. And so I think if you get 7Sage for a few months, they have very good Logic Games materials. You can consume all of their Logic Games lessons and learn what you can. Cancel that subscription, switch over to Demon. They have a better reputation for logical reasoning. So you consume all of their LR resources and get good at that. That's a good foundation right there. That's two of the three section types that you know which product is kind of targeted toward learning that. I do like those subscription services. Ultimately, if you can afford a private tutor, a good one, that's going to be the most efficient route to improvement. It's just cost prohibitive for most people. And it's not because the tutors are greedy. I promise you, it's because tutors don't get benefits or a guaranteed 40 hours a week. I mean, it's a risky business model to go out there and say, hire me whenever you want. I'm available at your convenience. You have to leverage the risk somehow. And so that entails, for students who don't want to commit to a high number of hours, it entails a high hourly rate. So that's why the tutoring is so expensive. I know there's a lot of hand wringing and consternation, and people look at the tutors as kind of greedy, but they don't, the ones who do this full time don't have a safety net. They don't have a job with benefits. They have to provide for their families and have some stability using a really uncertain business model. The thing that you can do if you want to make the cost of tutoring more affordable, the reason I'm mentioning all this is commit to a bulk purchase. That gives the tutor some assurance that you won't fire him or her 1 or 2 sessions in. So find a tutor that you like and you're willing to commit with and say, what kind of discount can you give me if I buy 5 hours or 10 hours up front? I think you'd be really surprised how much people are willing to reduce their rates for a bulk purchase. All right, looks like Anthony's bowing out. It was a 1-hour session, but I'll stay 5 more minutes if there's any more questions. And if you guys have to go, I totally understand.
I have a question.
Sure. What's your name?
Oh, sorry. Sorry to the other young lady.
I'll take both. Go ahead, Levon. Is that your name?
Yes.
Okay.
So my question is, how do I successfully blind review? I do work part-time, and I don't feel like this has anything to really do with work, but it's more so, how do I successfully blind review? I haven't really completed a full prep test yet. I'm set to do my tests later this year. So how do I successfully blind review my incorrect answers and move forward with that? I'm kind of almost in the middle of my journey here.
Sure. I just shared a link in the chat, which has the infographics that I created to explain my triple review process. I think that there actually should be 3 rounds of review, not just 2. And so, but if you don't agree, you can just take the blind review material and look at that. But I think the key to an effective blind review is this. You shouldn't look up the answers. You shouldn't score the section. You shouldn't know which questions you missed. You shouldn't even identify problem questions. You should literally go back after the time test and answer every single question again with no time limit. And you do a more thorough approach. You read the argument again, you read the question again, you go through a process of predicting the answer. You're more critical of the answer choices. You interpret them more carefully. You document reasons why each one is wrong or why the one you're choosing is correct. It takes me about 4 hours to blind review a section because I'm looking at each question with a kind of thoroughness and creativity that I would never have time for on a time test. I want to understand every angle of every question before my blind review is done. I don't always accomplish that, which is evidenced by the fact that I still get some wrong occasionally, even on blind review. But my goal is at the end of blind review, I should know every detail of every answer. I should be very, very confident in every one of my answers. And then after that blind review, that's when I go back and look up the answers and I score both of my attempts. How many did I get right and wrong timed? How many did I get right and wrong blind? And what's the mapping of the two? Were they the same questions that I missed both times, or was it a different set of questions? And then I can start to parse out what I did wrong and when. I like this better because if you're only focusing on your mistakes, here's what you're not doing. You're not reinforcing all of the good things that you did on the questions you got right. And I want my students, if they did something really well on their time test and they got the answer correct, I want them to go through and do that question again so that they can confirm from themselves, that's a good way to do that question. That was perfect. But if you're only looking at the questions you got wrong, you have no opportunity to say, wow, I did that one really well. I need to reinforce what I did there. I need to do more of that. Instead, students tend to focus on what they don't want to do, their mistakes. And I really like to reinforce the successes as well. So I like blind review, not just to review questions you missed, to review your thinking, because there's no way in hell I can give a question a thorough analysis in a minute and a half. Even if I get it right, I didn't do as much as I could. And if I just slow down on blind review, I can be more confident about my answers and I can understand some of the dynamics that sort of I didn't quite grasp the first time. There's a lot of times on blind review, this is embarrassing to admit, there's a lot of times on blind review where I realize I chose the right answer, but for the wrong reason. I got lucky. I didn't quite grasp it. And I just was lucky that they didn't present an answer choice that targeted the particular misunderstanding that I made. Occasionally they do, and I get them wrong, but there's other times where I mistake something and they just weren't clever enough to give me the answer choice to grab my attention. And so I figure it out eventually and I'll say, okay, that's not right. Maybe this other thing. On blind review, that's when I usually come back and think, you know what? I was totally wrong. That prediction was stupid. It was hasty. And on a minute and a half, I'm going to occasionally make some bad decisions. Okay, Tajay, you want to do one more question before we wrap it up?
Yes. My question was geared more towards how do I strengthen my approach to logical reasoning? Because I feel as though that's where I'm not, even though when I try to go back and restudy, I'm not really changing my study habits or how I'm understanding it. So I was trying to get a different perspective on any approaches I can do to strengthen how I'm approaching these questions or how I'm answering them. More so on like assumption questions. I don't know if I should like start back at the basics with that to try to like, I don't know. It's kind of different.
Yeah, LR is interesting to me. Most young tutors become good at teaching logic games. And I also had this pattern. Early in my career, I had insights into helping students with logic games that the older materials weren't getting at. I mean, look at like Fadi Yatuma. If you don't know him, join his group. He's a young guy prepping for the LSAT, and he does a bunch of free logic game sessions every week. Let me type his name in here so you guys can look him up. He's very creative when it comes to logic games. What I find, though, is that developing a system for LR is much more difficult. It took me, I didn't do that early in my career. It took me 20 years in before I had a really good system for LR. I'd like to try to teach you my LR system. So let's start communicating by private message and see if we can figure out a way to get you in one of my classes or in some of the pro bono groups, because the way that it's currently taught, I think, is kind of, how do I want to explain this? It's not, there's no framework for it. They want everything to be disjointed. There's a dozen question types and they're all different and you're doing different things at different times. My system is more rooted in the skills that are common to the LR questions. How do you create a deductively valid argument? And instead of thinking about flaws right away, I find that that's sort of premature. How can you think about why an argument is flawed when you can't construct a valid argument to begin with? So I'd use a different approach. Instead of jumping right toward why are the answers wrong, what are the flaws of the argument, I do this system where I teach my students, how do we make proper arguments? What are the components? This is what I was talking about before, the syllogism, the major, the minor premise. How do we construct a valid argument? Once you understand that, it's so much easier to see why an argument doesn't accomplish what the proper form does accomplish. If all you're looking at is the broken argument and you don't have the good one, the proper one to compare it to, it's hard to see where it goes wrong. Even when someone describes it to you, look, there's the flaw. It's like, well, but why? That's the flaw because the proper argument would look like this. The proper argument would contain that, and it's missing in this argument. So when we talk about flaws, we're talking about what isn't there. It's an abstraction, something that's missing. How can you picture what isn't there if you've never seen the picture when it is there? I like to analogize it like this. The LR arguments, it's kind of like getting a puzzle in a box that's deconstructed. That's how they give you the argument. Random order, just a bunch of sentences. They don't tell you how that logic works. What's the proper way to organize and structure those ideas? They don't even tell you what the conclusion is in many cases. You have to figure it out. So what your job is as the test taker is to take that box of pieces and put them together so that you can find out which one is missing. And I think what most of the strategy guys tell you to do is they tell you to take the box of pieces and sort of inspect them one by one without putting the puzzle together. And then you figure out by sort of process of elimination which one isn't there, which piece of the puzzle. You're sort of looking at the front of the box and taking each piece and matching it. Here it is, here it is, here it is. And then at the end of the day, you will be missing one. It seems so backward to me. Why not just put the puzzle together? And then it will be so damn obvious which piece is missing that it would be silly to even ask the question. That's how I approach LR. Instead of constantly poking at what's missing, what's wrong, what's the flaw, what I want to think about is what's the proper version of that argument. Let's put the pieces together and then we compare the proper version to what they've actually given us so that we can take that one missing piece and isolate and identify it. I've got a very different model that I'd like to share with you. So attend more of my pro bono sessions and reach out to me by private message, and let's try to see if we can find a way to connect so you can learn that model. Okay, well, my time's up. I'm going to sign off, everybody. Thank you for attending today. Every Wednesday, I do the session for repeaters and high scorers. Thursdays, I do one for non-traditional students. I know some of you are working adults, so if you want to come tomorrow evening, 8 p.m. Eastern is my Thursday session for non-trads. And if you ever miss these, they are on YouTube. So feel free to subscribe, follow me on Facebook. Have a good day, everybody.